the New York Times article points out that Netanyahu is funding these armed militia groups in Gaza. And I guess the question for me is, I mean, does this tactic sound familiar to you, given what we know about Hamas and the opposition of Hamas to the PLO, and how much Netanyahu or the Israeli government in general have supported, not supported, I mean, encouraged Islamist organizations, Islamist groups, and pitted them against more secular, the PLO and other groups. This seems to be a version of that, though in this case, it seems to be that they're doing it with really extreme elements in Gaza, people who are, you could say, are ISIS and Daesh members, and they are fueling and arming these individuals. And if we look back at history, this can only cause more chaos, more bloodshed, and more instability.
Yes, well, there's a lot to unpack here. I'd like to start with your first point about how this issue registered on the radar of the mainstream media. Of course, Palestinian journalists have been reporting about this for some time, but on the one hand, they're dismissed under their reports are dismissed under all sorts of spurious pretexts by journalists who also don't have the courage to say that the reason they can't go into the Gaza Strip and verify or disprove these reports is because Israel is preventing them from entering the Gaza Strip, and they appear to be totally fine with that. The second issue is that the reason we are now talking about this, at least why the mainstream media is now talking about this, is because a statement was made by Avigdor Lieberman, a former close associate of Netanyahu, a former defense minister in one of his cabinets, one of the far right leaders in Israel, but he used to be actually Netanyahu's chief of staff or head of his office. And as with virtually everyone else who has a close relationship with Netanyahu, they eventually had a bitter falling out. And Lieberman came out with a statement, excuse me, that Israel, at Netanyahu's direction, was funding gangs in the Gaza Strip that were aligned with ISIS. And Netanyahu then came out and said, actually, yes, we are supporting clans that are opposed to Hamas, and that Israel is doing so not at the initiative of Netanyahu, but at the recommendation of the security forces, which appears to be another one of his serial untruths, and that Netanyahu saw nothing wrong with it. So I think it was the buzzword ISIS that got the Western media interested in this. Now, if you look at this closely, these are often these groups that Israel is supporting are sometimes being portrayed as ISIS clans or extended families that are aligned with ISIS. That's actually not the case. What these are criminal gangs that, in some cases, have affiliations with ISIS that appear to be linked to other gangs in the Sinai Peninsula that are either ISIS or work with ISIS, but their main activity appears to be not so much ideological as criminal. The head of this particular gang, Yasser Abu Shabab, made his name as a drug runner and had been in prison in the Gaza Strip for these activities. And he and a number of his key deputies have in fact been disowned and disavowed by their families and by their clans. So the idea that here we're dealing with clans rather than criminal gangs is not entirely accurate. And they cooperate with ISIS. They're affiliated with ISIS. They're in some cases aligned with ISIS, but they're not, let's say, their motivation is primarily criminal rather than ideological. Though having said that, it also needs to be pointed out that starting on October 7th, every Israeli leader who could get near a microphone and then amplified by every Western leader who could get near a microphone, most prominently Joe Biden, not only immediately began comparing Hamas to ISIS, but even routinely making the statement that Hamas is even worse than ISIS. Well, lo and behold, once again, every accusation is a confession, because who was arming ISIS, if you want to put it that way? Who was working most closely with ISIS? It's Israel, uh, not not uh, not Hamas. And you mentioned that this could be compared to Israel's encouragement of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Hamas in the occupied territories during the 1980s and early 1990s. I don't think it's a very good analogy, as the Muslim Brotherhood and later Hamas was a political movement, and then became an armed national liberation movement as well. And Israel did not establish these movements, but certainly when they were primarily politically quiescent, it indirectly supported them and it encouraged their activities in order, the typical approach of divide and rule, the typical approach of sowing chaos and confusion in Palestinian ranks. And it hoped to encourage these groups in order to weaken the PLO and its constituent organizations. Well, that worked in some respects, and of course, today the largest and most organized and most popular Palestinian organization is not the PLO or any of its constituent factions, but rather Hamas. What I think we're seeing here is something different, because again, these groups are primarily criminal gangs. They may call themselves popular forces, but they're not an ideologically based movement. They're not a popularly based movement. They're not a political movement. They're criminal gangs collaborating with the Israeli occupation. And the prospect that they can hold even a square millimeter of Palestinian territory without the direct support of the Israelis is exactly 0.00. And therefore, I think a much better analogy for them is not the way that Israel sought to encourage the Muslim Brotherhood in the occupied territories, but rather the collaborationist South Lebanon Army in southern Lebanon during the 1970s and until Israel was expelled from southern Lebanon in 2000. And the minute the last Israeli soldier left southern Lebanon, the South Lebanon Army ceased to exist, and its forces went scurrying into Israel in order to avoid accountability for their collaboration in Lebanon. I think that's a much better analogy.